Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Dr. James Giordano, who is the director of the Center for Disruptive Technologies and Future Warfare of the Institute for National Strategic Studies at the National Defense University. G. Giordano, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, John. It's a pleasure to be here.
And do you have any kind of a disclaimer that you need to give at the top so that people know where you're coming from?
Yeah, absolutely. As an employee of the Department of Defense, just so your listeners know that everything that I say here represents my perspectives and my particular opinions and doesn't necessarily reflect those of the United States government, the Department of Defense, or the National Defense University.
All right, excellent. So the topics that I'd like to cover with you today, G, will focus on neurotechnology and future warfare. But before we get too far into this, could we start by getting your assessment of our strategic landscape, or if you prefer, the times in which we live?
I'm just one little voice and one little view from among many. But I think the other thing that I happen to bring to the picture is that I've lived for 7+ decades. And so what we're really seeing, I think, is a change in aspects of the strategic picture. Most notably, we're seeing a shift in the balances of global power away from the predominance of what used to be known as, quote, the West, right? Certainly, we're seeing a rise in the capability of China with regard to its scientific, technological, economic, and military capability on the global stage, much of that being leveraged with regard to soft power, but certainly I think that soft power can also yield hard power domains and dimensions on a number of different levels, on the non-kinetic scale, as well as escalating along that spectrum to possible kinetic engagements. Similarly, I think we're seeing a revival of very strong nationalist tendencies in what used to be the Soviet Union, now Russia. And that combination of those two large power sources as international peer competitors, coupled with some of the changing postures with the global South, are, I think, influencing the current not only tactical landscape in terms of what types of power domains are tactically leverageable right now, both with regard to sociocultural leverage, scientific and technological leverage, certainly economic leverage, and the multiple usability of science and technology in those ways that are viable in programs of national security, intelligence, and defense operations. And so what we're really seeing is something of a shift. We're seeing a shift towards multiple large-scale powers, of which the United States and the European Union and some of our international Pacific allies are certainly constituent. But I think we're also needing to appreciate, as I said, the rise of other great powers, such as China predominantly, and Russia, and the use of their power influences to engage various second and third tier nations, Iran, North Korea, for example, and the use of various proxies, inclusive of non-state actors who can then leverage some of the science and technology for both tactical means and perhaps for aspects of strategic domination or hegemony within key niches. So, to my view, that represents the current and near-term strategic conditions that are in a state of flux. And I think it's important to recognize that a state of flux can literally be translated into a state of crisis. Literally, the word means time of change.
Hmm.
And it becomes important to understand what are the precipitative factors in that crisis, and then what crisis management or change management means with regard to retaining capabilities of national power national hegemony and national leverage in light of these shifting architectonics on the global stage.
Mm. What was that very last word that you used? Did you say
Arch
architectonic?
Architectonics, yeah, I mean, think of the large sort of tectonic plates
Uh-huh. Okay.
that represent, if you will, the sort of continental masses. But instead of them literally being geographic plates, think of them
Uh,
as nationalistic or cultural plates. And
uh,
those plates rub together, and the way those plates rub together establish various fault lines, vulnerability and volatility lines, and also determine which one of those plates, if you will, of national, cultural, economic, and perhaps military power rise above the others. So if you literally think of them in terms of tectonic shifts in power and capability on the global stage, I think that provides a pretty good sight picture.
mm. I have never heard that word before, but I really do like it, and I've thought about the information environment as yeah, well, all of this is complex systems, right? And systems interacting with one another in nonlinear, very difficult to predict. Some people say unpredictable ways, at least for the long term, perhaps, maybe in the very, very, very short term, predicting what might happen, like in kind of like a next state kind of a prediction, like very near term prediction might be possible. But thinking about how complex systems are interacting with one another, as you were just describing, there's like seams and gaps and peaks and valleys of things that are actors interacting with one another, and I've thought of that in the same kind of a way, although I've never heard the word architectonics before.
Yeah, but you bring up a great point, John, which is what you're really dealing with is systems embedded within systems.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
once you appreciate the reality of that, then it becomes important to understand that systems functions or the mechanics of those systems are complex, have aspects that are both chaotic and non-chaotic. And
Hmm.
forecasting, if not predicting within those systems, requires two things. Number one, to understand the particular system you're trying to forecast or predict in, but also to try to get some insight to how that system is reliant upon and interacts with the other systems, both
Hmm.
up and down range, not only spatially, in other words, how are those systems dynamically interacting with regard to their nodes and networks of intersection, but temporally as well, across time, in the proximate past, in the less than proximate past,
Yep.
and then also looking at particular vistas in the future. In other words, the vista of probability. For example, the past 5 years to the next 5 years, we consider that to be the vista or the horizon of probability, which, to your point earlier, I think is relatively easy to forecast and predict because you're assessing current conditions for their relatively near future term effects based upon an understanding of all those variables in play that are salient, that are sentinel to you. You get beyond that point. You start to go 6 to 10 to 15 years in the future. Now you're dealing with the vista of possibility. So, of all those things that are probable, once certain probabilities are realized, then you have a better view to what kind of things might be possible, not only given the change in a system, but how that system affects and is affected by the other systems in which it engages. That's a little more difficult to be able to forecast and predict, but yet not impossible. Some of the new tools of modeling, machine learning, and AI are helpful in that regard because you can do big data multivariate predictions and analyses. But you start to get beyond that. You get out past 15 years, and this is called the vista or the horizon of potentiality. And now you have to really account for multiple fractal diffusion. Things are really diffusing in a fractalized way. And as you said earlier, these functions tend to be nonlinear. And they're prone not only to the sensitivity of their initial conditions, but
Hmm.
those initial conditions change as a consequence of new elements of the system arising. So as new things arise, conditions that exist are those initial conditions. And then you have various attractors in that system that'll pull the directionality or flavor of how that system progresses in a variety of different directions. So all of those things have to figure into the relative calculus of forecasting and prediction.
Yeah, totally agree with all of that, and you're hitting on like some of the bingo card thing items for the cognitive crucible with complex systems. Another guest that we had quite a while ago, I had a look at having him back on, Noah Comnick, who also served with the Marines, by the way. But Noah, I believe I forget whether this was an offline discussion I had with him. It's not sensitive or anything, or during the podcast, but he was talking about boundaries and
Mhm.
system boundaries, and how you were talking about flux and being in the state of flux. And you can also go to MCDP1 or FMFM1 warfighting with the Marine Corps, talking about the culminating point in the transition from offense to defense, or defense to office. But the point, offense, the point is, transitions are interesting. They introduce opportunity, but they also introduce risk. And the flux, back to your, I think your main point was earlier, with some of these big changes that are happening globally, uh, among the great powers, with technology. This flux that's happening, in a complexity sense, both introduces risk and opportunity. What are your thoughts about that?
Oh, look, without a doubt. I mean, what I've had the great pleasure and opportunity to work with DARPA for a while,
Ah,
particularly coming into the early teens. We had a number of DARPA projects had been launched under, at that time, the relatively new program called the BRAIN Initiative, that they came out right after Obama won to the second Obama term. And the BRAIN Initiative is brain research through advancing innovative neurotech. And the lion's share of first-year BRAIN Initiative funding went to DARPA. And the reason for that was axiomatic, because what DARPA does is tend to engage as high risk, high yield, high reward projects. And the way they approach high risk, high yield, and high reward projects is through the use of something called the Heilmeyer Catechism.
hmm
It's essentially a six-step process that basically asks what's happening now, does it work or does it not? If it doesn't work, why doesn't it work? What can you do to fix that it works? What is the cost in terms of benefit, burden, and risk? And then ultimately, how will that thing that you fixed fit in with the larger picture? In other words, what are going to be its influential effects? In this way, what you're saying is, do the actual benefits outweigh any burdens with regard to cost and time of development? And so you can look at risk in those ways and try to assess and mitigate what certain risks are, prevent them as you can, and then recognize that other risks may be forgivable because the outcomes or the deliverables that you get by taking those risks are going to counter what might be the burdens of not engaging the risks. So when you look at risk this way, it becomes important to assess risks and benefits of both commission, doing the thing, and omission, not doing a thing.
hmm
And I think that becomes part of any meaningful approach towards a realistic engagement of sort of the go or no go decision with regard to, particularly in my field, adopting or developing new aspects of science and technology that are broadly usable in a variety of different applications.
Okay. Um, so, looking at your bio in prep for the discussion today, I noticed that your PhD is in biopsychology. You may be the first biopsychologist on the Cognitive Crucible. So, a Cognitive Crucible first. Could you describe what biopsychology is and how it relates to today's opportunities and challenges?
Yeah, well, biopsychology is the degree that old guys like me got before there were actually degrees in neuroscience. And
Okay.
that is the God's truth. When I got
Okay.
into the field, oh, 45 years ago, there were literally just a few titular programs in neuroscience, a few. And at that time, certainly aspects of the brain sciences were being studied, but they were being studied in somewhat more siloed resources. So the actual field of neurosciences, when I got into the field in the late 1970s, was actually very new, was very nascent. So the brain sciences and the interaction between brain structure and its functions, particularly its cognitive and behavioral functions, was very interesting to me. And the program that appealed to me is a program in biological or biopsychology, understanding biological bases for psychological functions of cognitions and behaviors. And that's what biopsychology is. So it really was at that time, and still is. I mean, that program is still in existence at the City University of New York. Um, a contributory aspect of to what then became more largely the rubric of the neurosciences. So it was sort of the cognitive, behavioral neurosciences with a very strong biological base, which was then based upon chemical, cellular, molecular, and anatomical neurosciences as well. So that was the degree.
Wow. Maybe almost like bioinformatics, I think, was like the earlier version of what some might say is data science or computer science today.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you look at bioinformatics, bioinformatics in many ways can be parsed into two areas. You're looking at the biological aspects of informatics. So in some ways that could be cognitive neuroscience, or neuroinformatics.
Hmm.
And we're actually looking at the way informatics can then serve and inform the biological sciences. And
Hmm.
so that intersection there, one direction goes into creative neuromorphic computing, creating biologically based computational systems. And the other is the use of large scale information, big data, cyber informational and machine learning systems, various forms of AI in the biological sciences. So yeah, I mean, it kind of an equivalent approach based upon how the field evolved and what became titular aspects of the fields.
Okay, cool. Well, now that I've gotten this, kind of like out of a couple of John Bicknell initiated rabbit holes, we can maybe talk a little bit more directly about the topic at hand. But neurotechnology, this also seems to be a pretty broad term. Do you think you could, yeah, how would you introduce this topic to you're at the National Defense University. How would you introduce this to a thoughtful group of students and relate it to today's national security challenges?
Well, if I were talking to my beloved Marines, I would start by introducing them to crayons. I think that's very important. It's always good to
Uh,
have a snack before we talk.
a
Uh,
snack.
so,
That's right. Yeah. Okay.
so but it's sort of the crayon description, and I mean that literally. In other words, if we were to take a very colorful description and use all the crayons in the 64 box, complete with the sharpener, what you'd
Yeah.
see is that there's a lot of different sciences that go into the neurosciences, right? I mean, just think about the ways we can study the brain. We can study the brain genetically, molecularly, chemically, anatomically, cellularly, systemically. We can look at how the brain influences cognition. We can look at how the brain influences behavior. We can engage how the brain is influencing and influenced by social issues. We can take a look at human neuroscience, animal neuroscience, invertebrate neuroscience, comparative neuroscience. So there's a number of different sciences that feed into it. All of those, think of them as colored crayons. Right? You can draw similar pictures of the brain with a variety of different crayons, but there's more. It begs the question, what comes first, the
Mm,
knowledge or the tool? And in many ways, it's sort of like a dance where both partners lead.
mm,
I think the task is what prompts. You want to know something. And you use the tools you have, and very often the tools you have are fundamental. Your eyes, your ears, your senses. You acquire that through observation. You move things around as sort of fundamental manipulation. And then what you want to do is dig a little bit deeper. You want to look more granularly or look farther. So you develop those tools of observation and assessment. With those tools and observation and assessment, then you develop new knowledge. So there's this interesting paradigm of tools to theory and theory to tools. And in the brain sciences, particularly, you can't extricate those two.
mm,
You can't do neuroscience without the tools necessary to do that science. And the science then guides the development of ever more capable, specific, powerful tools. And ultimately, if you think of it sort of in a meta construct, If what we're doing is we're trying to inform ourselves about the way brains work, then what you're doing is you're developing the brain as a tool through the use of ever more sophisticated tools that allow you to study and access that tool, which is the brain. So, in essence, what we actually talk about today is something called neuroscience and technology. We combine that into an acronym called Neuro, S and T. And what that really describes is the inextricability and very reciprocal interrelationship between the science of the way we study the brain, what we know and how we know it, and the tools we use both to study the brain and based upon our knowledge of the brain, the tools we then use to access and affect the brain in a variety of ways. In some of those ways, to sharpen the brain as a tool.
Wow, that is really good, G. That really does kind of illuminate the the uh, the space. I I think I heard this word from. Are you familiar with the researcher Carl Friston?
Oh,
Probably
yeah.
yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes.
I think he might not have come up with this term, but he used the term enactivism with an E. And what I recall him saying is that in a very literal way, we are co-creators with our environment. And so the environment influences us and we influence the environment. And as you were talking about innovation and new tools, we create tools in order to deal with environmental stimuli or in order to work with our environment so that we can pursue our goals. But then simultaneously, our environment influences us to create these tools. And there's like I might not get this word right, but like a dialectic,
Yeah, yeah.
within all of these systems. And it's the same thing with unconscious or it's not just with people, but it's with animals and plants and everything interacts with everything in this dialectic. Does that make sense in the context of what you're talking
It
about as well?
wholly resonates. Now, you hit the nail on the head. I think in Friston's use of the term enactivism, which is really great. It's really spot on because what it demonstrates is there's a reciprocal level of enacting.
Hmm.
We talk about the fact that a brain is embodied. I mean, the brain sits in a body. It grew up with that body. It functions in that body. You understand and engage the world through your embodied brain. But that body is embedded in an environment in space and time, which then
Hmm.
harkens back to the discussion we had earlier, which is that you can't extricate systems from systems. So the systems that is the brain, that are the brain, those soupy, sparky cells in our head that constitute the nodes and networks of our neurological systems, exist within the systems of our bodies, which exist within the systems of our ecologies, which
Hmm.
interact with
Hmm.
other organisms and their systems. And all of these things are interrelated on a variety of levels, some that are far more intimate and touching, and others that are far more distal and perhaps not necessarily directly touching, but indirectly certainly have effect uprange and downrange. So that idea, that relative quote butterfly effect that they talk
Hmm.
about in complexity, where a butterfly flaps its wings somewhere in the Caribbean, a tsunami is launched somewhere in the Pacific, I think reflect the fact that those systems are hierarchically interactive and reciprocally interactive. And that really gets back to the idea of enactivism as understanding what those dynamical relationships are and how we need to approach them.
Right. Um, uh, so with the kinds of technology dynamics that are as you're talking about like neuro S&T, bringing this into like a more of like a here and now national security concern context. Um, uh, who are the actors that are uh, doing things, developing things, and what are the kinds of things that are being developed that relate to today's either current operations or, relatively near-term future operations?
Well, it's a great question. And if I could, I'd like to answer the question, take the question in reverse order.
Sure.
We'll talk about the what first, and then we'll address the who question. Because I think there's some variation in who's doing what. So if we look at the what kinds of things exist in the toolkit of neuro S&T, we can parse neuroscience and technology down into three basic categories. Science and technological approaches that are used to assess the brain. In other words, such things like various forms of neuroimaging, various types of genetic assays, various phenotypic assays, various types of biomarkers, and a host of data that can be acquired from individuals' social cognitive interactions that are increasingly being ubiquitously made available through the internet and a variety of media. All of those things can then be yoked back and related back to existing functions of an individual's brain. In other words, what we can do is we can kind of triangulate, if you will, individuals' purchasing patterns, behaviors, social interactions, some of their cognitive expressions, with known aspects of how their brains are functioning, and then what aspects of the brain and what sites of the brain may be doing this. It's a huge project, but it is certainly one that is underway, and one in which that we scientifically, globally, have sort of stepped into the waiting room for. Increasing in iterative sophistication and what we're able to do with neuroimaging allows us to view the living brain in a variety of concepts of thought, task, behaviors, responses. And then we're able to not only view that in an individual, but in multiple individuals. And through the use of big data and AI, we're able to compare individuals to groups, groups to individuals, and individuals to other individuals and or themselves across time. Well, if that represents the assessment category, the next question is, well, what are we going to do with these assessments? And the answer is quite simple. We use these assessments in means to be able to access the brain so as to affect the brain, either indirectly or directly. Indirectly through things like narratives, symbols, marketing, information, sentiments, interpersonal relations, what essentially falls into the field of either neuromarketing or neuroeconomics. And I think on the military side, now you're looking at such things as narrative engagement or narrative national defense, psychological operations, and the new domain, which we refer to as cognitive engagements, or perhaps more colloquially, cognitive warfare. But I think if we go with that sort of military language and construe it even in the medical sense, what we're really trying to do here is we're trying to identify various structures of the brains that are related to various functions of the brain in individuals and in groups so that we can target those structures in some way to be able to modify those functions, which then gets us into the next domain, which are the interventional neuroscience and technological toolkits, which includes such things as certainly drugs. And the more we know about the brain on an ever more granular, ever more specific, ever more systematic, systems-based level, the more we're able to develop drugs that are far more sharp shot than buckshot, that have selective effects without a host of adverse, deleterious, burdensome, or harmful side effects. But drugs are just one way. I mean, certainly we can use various forms of electronic and magnetic stimulation and modulation of the brain. Some of these things are as easy to take on and off as perhaps headphones or a skull cap. And that ease of donning and doffing, in other words, taking a thing on and taking a thing off, is able to affect certain brain sites, structures, and nodes. Although relatively superficially, we're increasing the sophistication of that technology to be able to dial in a higher level of specificity and precision through transcranial electrical, magnetic, or vagal nerve stimulation. But I think the most compelling, and probably that which is the most provocative and at the same time contentious, is the growing field of indwelling brain modulation. This is not all that new. We've been using deep brain stimulation to treat a variety of movement disorders and neurodegenerative disorders for a number of years with relatively good success. But what is new is the specificity and the precision of which we're able to map various targets in the brain and develop very, very, very precise multifunctional sensing and transmitting electrodes that are so well engineered that they can be placed with high precision to be able to control, modulate a whole host of neurological functions, inclusive of not just disease states and degenerative states of the brain, to be able to repair a broken brain, if you will, but also that can be used for cognitive, emotional, and behavioral modulation and modification, inclusive of performance enhancement and optimization and/or performance degradation in some cases. Now, where it certainly is an issue is that obviously any kind of indwelling brain modulatory implant would need to be neurosurgically implanted. And I think unless someone is living in a cave, they recognize that one of the newer developments on the market is a form of kind of direct-to-consumer approach that has been
Hmm.
pioneered by Elon Musk's Neuralink. I
Hmm.
must tell you, in full candor, and I would say the same if Mr. Musk were sitting across from me, Neuralink is not all that sophisticated. I mean, as far
Hmm.
as the actual technological sophistication of the device,
Hmm.
it's far less sophisticated and capable than some of the state-of-the-art medical devices that are being produced by a variety of other companies and firms. However,
Do you think, G, sorry to
sure,
interrupt your flow there, but uh, could you describe a little bit more like what the device is, or what these other similar devices that you just also mentioned? Well, I mean,
sure,
what?
sure.
Yeah, well, I mean, what is
So,
and what does this look like
so,
to
so
get
if we,
implanted? Yeah,
I mean, it's, I mean, the easiest thing I think for your listeners to do is to Google
yeah.
Neuralink, and they can
Okay,
see what the device is. It's essentially an electrode or series of electrodes
okay.
that are neurosurgically implanted into targeted localized areas of the brain that deliver a very low but very specific electrical current pulse to those brain areas that therefore allow modulation of the node and network activity of those brain regions that control certain functions.
Mhm.
The electrode itself is connected by a very thin wire to a power distributor, which is then connected to some type of computational regulatory system, which is then programmed to deliver these pulses to the brain, either in what's called an open loop system, in other words, where it's externally controlled, or a closed loop system, where it's essentially sensing what's happening in the brain and in the body and responding to that in real time to keep the brain within a relatively tight set of functional parameters. That's the basic architecture of the hardware, right?
Mhm.
The but Neuralink is providing, for all intents and purposes, is a form of almost direct to consumer market where now individuals who seek this can appeal to get this. And yes, although the low hanging fruit is for individuals who have medical conditions that would dictate that a brain implant is going to be of benefit to them, if you recall some of the rhetoric of Mr. Musk's early marketing of Neuralink, he wanted an implant in everybody's brain so that we could remain apace with the coming, quote, singularity and rise of the machines. In other words, everyone should have this. Well, that was very rhetorical, but what he did do in a very entrepreneurial way is sort of establish a new niche, which is quasi direct to consumer indwelling brain implants.
Hmm.
And this represents sort of a new domain and dimension. And what it has done is it's sort of changed the posture of the patient as consumer. Now, there is growing concern about individuals who may want one of these implants, who may or may not necessarily be qualified to get one. Perhaps insurance doesn't qualify them, or perhaps even their condition doesn't qualify them.
Huh.
Or could these devices then be used not necessarily to cure something that is, quote, wrong, but to make certain things better? And the
Hmm.
answer to that question is yes, of course. And this raises a host of not only technical, but certainly ethical, legal, and social issues,
Hmm.
not least of which is who gets the goodies and what are we using the goodies for? Now, in comparison, you asked me to compare what is Neuralink versus some of the others.
Sure. Yeah.
Some of the more state-of-the-art devices include one that is known as the Omni device, which was developed by Lawrence Livermore Laboratories in conjunction with Massachusetts Institute of Technology, off of a DARPA program. And the Omni device is a multiple electrode device that is very specific, that senses brain states and stimulates brain states relatively remotely. And it is very, very sophisticated. Think of it sort of like the Ferrari or the Lamborghini of brain implant modulation, whereas Neuralink would be something more like a more affordable commuter car.
Okay.
But here's where it gets really, really cheeky. The state of the art in implantable brain modulation is the idea of non-surgical or minimally invasive indwelling brain stimulation and modulation. In other words, the use of nanomaterials,
Yeah, that's exactly, well,
non-human materials.
that's exactly what I started thinking about is nanotechnology, but I don't know, perhaps not like deliberately ingested and
Um,
injected nanotechnology, but nanotechnology that can almost be released into the wild like Stuxnet, just like put it on the winds and let the winds carry it globally, and it like plastics. I've done just a little bit of armchair Googling. That's about the extent of my research on this, but the concern that yeah, since the 1950s or when plastics first started becoming really common, all the way through today, is that plastics are everywhere, and you cannot take a scoop of sand anywhere on Earth and not find human-made plastics within the sand sample. So like that, someone creates nanobots or something that can just be just released into the wild, and over time, it's
I mean, yeah, I mean
okay. All
that's
right,
no, no, no. I
you
mean
you get
that's
where I'm
that's
going. Yeah,
well, no,
yeah,
it's the stuff of a very good Michael Crichton novel, and it is, right? I
that's
mean,
right.
it is.
Yeah.
And I think those worries and those concerns very often are expressed in fiction, and that's what good science fiction does. It
Hmm.
takes a kernel of reality and then spins it in a fictional yarn that prompts our consideration
Hmm.
and our concerns, appropriately so. And, we are worried about the idea of large scale, like you talk about microplastics, large scale release and or inadvertent dumping of nanomaterials that then aggregate into this proverbial quote gray glue or gray goo that have this sort of integrity of its own. They're very, very difficult to environmentally deal with. But on the safety side,
Yes, that's
right?
very well
Yeah,
said. Yes,
yeah, on,
exactly
on,
that.
on the
Yes.
safety side, I mean, one of the things about many of these nanomaterials are they need to be specifically engineered to do something.
Hmm.
And many of these nanomaterials, as you know, are in fact inert, and their penetration into biological organisms is limited, and so forth.
Okay.
However, you have raised an interesting point. In other words, is the nanoscale sort of the next frontier? Because things that exist at the nanoscale and the very low nanoscale and below may also exhibit particular quantum-like properties that allow very, very unique harnessing of mechanisms and processes that afford incredible capability for communication, for engagement of biological systems at the small to very large scale, but also allow internal to external communication in ways that heretofore have not been possible. So, for example, let me give you a real life example. DARPA has a program called N cubed or N3, which stands for Next Generation Non-Invasive Neuromodulation, that's looking to harness and exploit the capability of nanomaterials to create sensors and transmitters that can be impregnated into the brain space without surgery through the use of an inhaled device or by intravenous administration or perhaps even ingestion that can then be migrated into the brain utilizing a magnetic array that can then form a vast array of sensing and transmitting electrodes that are capable of reading information from the living brain remotely and writing information to the living brain remotely.
Hmm.
Now, obviously, that has tremendous potential in medicine, in communications, but of course, the dual use potential of this type of technology to be potentially weaponized or leveraged to gain control of very specific targetable individuals is, I think, equally a concern, a consideration, and is also the focus of a lot of ongoing ethical, legal, social, and national security discourse at DARPA. And I am privileged and very proud to say that I've been part of that discourse. So, yeah, I mean, the things that you bring up, as provocative and exciting and as potentially beneficial and benevolent as they are, certainly have a flip side of dual usability, whereby these things could be seen at least capriciously and certainly could be usurped to be used by in nefarious ways by bad actors.
Hmm. So, uh, flipping the conversation just a little bit, and then we got to start wrapping up. What is your comment on the accessibility of these kinds of technology, and just as a like a little primer, uh, technological superiority on the battlefield in, let's just say post World War II was like, if you didn't have, like very capable aircraft and, a healthy fleet of ships and, hardware and, that kind of stuff, you're not going to be a, contender on the geopolitical stage. But the kind of stuff that you're talking about, although a lot of this development might be happening in very sophisticated labs and startup technology firms where, funding is a, major part of the development. This kind of stuff can spill out, it seems to me, relatively
Mm.
easily, or these labs can be infiltrated relatively easily, and all of a sudden you've got, people or actor, non-state actor groups, countries that are not, just Russia, China, and the
Right.
U.S. with these kinds of technologies. On the doorstep of being operationalized. So how do you nest all of this into some kind of a uh, how are we going about
Yeah.
managing this kind of a massive,
I mean, your question is, all right,
surface
so
area?
now we
Yeah,
got this stuff. What next? I mean, I
yeah,
get.
right.
I mean, I think it harkens back to your earlier question that the first part of the two-part question that I chose to answer second is who's doing this? Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. There are incentives and efforts underway in the United States and our international economic, scientific, technological, and military allies, without a doubt. And I'd like to say that in many of these domains and dimensions, the United States continues to lead the field in the development of these scientific techniques and these various technologies. However, that lead is, I think, a very tenuous one for a number of different reasons. We're also seeing that our international peer competitors, primarily our Trans-Pacific peer competitor, China, is making tremendous inroads in these areas of science and technology to be able to create various devices and techniques based upon their relatively seamless fusion of their governmental agendas, inclusive of the military, their research enterprise, and their commercial industrial base. And so, yeah, we're certainly concerned about what's happening in China in these particular respective domains of science and tech. And we're equally concerned about what's happening in Russia, although the approach in Russia is somewhat different. I mean, it's not quite as overt with regard to market saturation and market dominance across not only national security and defense markets, but also biomedical markets. But you've raised another point, which is that just because we say, quote, the big three, in other words, the US and its international allies, China and Russia, are devoting time, resources, and energies to research, development, articulation, and use, that doesn't mean that those are going to be the sole user groups. Certainly, those countries to which those particular great powers are allied will have access to whatever is developed there. So we see lesser countries, North Korea, Iran, etc., having access to those larger countries' science and technology. And as you well noted, the availability of these technologies to either non-state actors or designated proxies also presents a worry when we're looking at the way that these technologies could be uptaken and or usurped for dual use purposes, weaponized purposes, which then I think really brings us over the wire sort of the take-home message here is that this type of devotion to scientific and technological advances must have a concomitant and equivalent devotion to understanding how these particular scientific and technological developments could be multiply used, inclusive in those ways that are duly usable in national security, intelligence, defense, both in those ways that can be defensive as well as offensive, and also to understand that biosecurity by design needs to be something that is developed and inculcated in any and all of these programs of scientific and technological progress. And this is something that my colleague Diane DeUlis and I have been beating a drum for the past 10 years. As we increase the capability of the science and technology, we have to marry that to dedication and commitment to biosecurity and biological safety, not only within the laboratories that are domestic so that things don't, quote, spill over and leak out or are not purloined or usurped, but also to readdressing global politics and policy so as to be able to revise existing signatory treaties and conventions to appreciate this much broader palette of scientific and technological developments that could be weaponized so as to increase oversight, regulation, governance, and control.
My goodness. All right. Well, I'm glad people like you and your colleagues, G, are working on these very issues. It sounds like uh, no no shortage of issues to be continually managed for sure. Well, so just wrapping up real quick, I'd like to ask you, G, if you have a research question that a student might take a crack at if they wanted to, help contribute to the body of knowledge in this problem space.
Oh yeah, sure. And I welcome that. I mean, I think that I learn so much from my students because they come to the field, I'm not going to say naive, but they come to the field untarnished by some of the burnishments that come along with long-term experience, exposure, and in some cases just being knocked around in the field. So they bring a really fresh eye. Here's the question. One of the things that we've talked about in our podcast here is how these various scientific tools and techniques could in fact be directed in ways that might be viable for military use, for warfare, for nefarious purposes, etc., and all of the burdens, risks, and harms that go along with that. Let's go back to the flip side of that coin. The research question that I'd like to pose to potential students is how could, or better yet, how should we engage these cutting edge developments of the brain sciences and their technologies to develop better relations between humans and other organisms in the environment, and also so as to be able to create deeper insights to the way humans think, emote, and behave, so as to reduce volatility towards violence and perhaps foster peace rather than using these things in weaponized ways to create war.
Okay, that's an excellent question. And finally, a book or online resource that you might suggest for people to check out if they want a deeper dive into any of these topics.
Well, it's either inadvertently or advertently, you've given me a wonderful opportunity for a bit of a self-promotional
Go
plug.
for it. Go for it.
So
Yes.
I'm very proud of two of our new books that have just been recently published. The first is one with my longstanding colleague, Dr. John Shook, and it's titled Bioethics and Brains, and it is published from the MIT Press. It just came out this year in 2025. Obviously, it is available from MIT directly and Amazon. And then another book, which is called Neuroscience, Neuroculture, Neuroethics, that we co-wrote. John Shook and I co-wrote with our international author, Dr. Rolly Benedictor from the Urac Center in Bozen, Italy. And that's available from Springer. This too is available from MIT Press. So those two books, I think, would provide the reader with a pretty good overview and in some cases a deep dive into this intersection between the brain sciences and what the brain sciences can do, and ethics, legality, and social issues that might help to dictate, define, steer, and therefore determine what kind of things we perhaps should do.
All right. Well, we will have links to those two books and to some of the other topics that we touched upon during the discussion and in the show notes. And with that, Dr. James G. Giordano, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's a real pleasure.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.